This is me, Vishwas Narayan, and I'm really honored that Brian J. Ford is on my podcast. And trust me, he's one of the most desired guests on this podcast. And also, this podcast is going to give you an ultimate prerequisite for everything that you're going to think about. Let it be life, let it be respect that you're just willing to just get. Let's just demystify why are you still alive and what is it all about being a human being for the tomorrow's world and how are we supposed to be today. So it's an honor to me to have you on my podcast, sir. Thank you so much for being on my podcast. It's a great honor to have you on my podcast.
Well, I thank you very much for your honourable introduction. I'm not sure that I can live up to it, but the next hour or so will prove whether I can.
Yes. So let me just ask you a simple question on like, are humans evolving and what's the unique identity that we have created in the world today? And in the universe, are we the most unique creature that we are still alive? Because I don't know about it, but I wanted to ask you this one question. What's the ultimate prerequisites to understand a human life?
The main prerequisite of understanding human life would be to be superhuman. We are trying to use the human brain to comprehend the human brain, but obviously that's never going to work. In order to understand what humans are like and how we belong in this massive firmament, then you would need to have something much greater and much more capable than humans to comprehend it all. I often think, that we're only using a tiny proportion of our brains. And time again, I'm aware of the fact that we get by knowing as much as we need to know to survive. That's all that matters. It's just that we know enough to communicate with our work, with our families, with shopkeepers, with transport and travel. And yet there are vast areas that people never understand, and vast areas of ignorance of which we remain blind. Indeed, many years ago, I put forward the idea, which you may like, that instead of teaching a specific subject in a college or a university from Monday to Friday, that Friday should be given not to teaching what we know, but to teaching what we don't know. And I'm a great believer in the study of the areas of ignorance that still surround us, because there is so much that we don't even realise we don't know. Journalists sometimes say to me, you seem very interested in the unanswered questions of life. And I say to them, no, I'm much more interested in the questions that are still unasked. It is the unasked questions which I like, much more than those that we've asked and failed to answer.
Yes. So I just wanted to realize this one thing, because what's the key to be the survivable? I always say this, if you are the fittest, they'll somehow kill you down, they'll tear you down, they'll rip you apart. But what's the key to be the survivable? Because it's not about like the ultimate goal that we have today, but it's the ultimate truth that we are going towards. But it's the survival of the survivable in this entire universe. So this universe is yet to discover a lot, because we are yet and somewhat an intelligent primate that we are looking at today. So I just wanted to understand, like, what is that yet to be understood aspect of this universe that humans are not focusing on, and what are we supposed to be focusing today?
Wait just 1 sec while I get a book.
I wrote a book on this subject, The Earth Watchers, and what this book said was very interesting. I pointed out that there is no scientific evidence that there is any form of life anywhere else in the universe. We've looked everywhere and we've never found anything. But if you do the simple mathematics and look at the number of stars in the number of galaxies throughout the universe, then it would be the ultimate in hubris for us to assume that we are the only form of intelligent life that can ever have existed. The Earth, this little round blue planet, is like an infinitesimally insignificant speck of dust floating in the outer regions of space. If the Earth as a planet disappeared, then nobody else in the universe would even notice. Well, they would notice the cessation of television transmissions if they were picking those up. But otherwise, we are so insignificant and so unimportant. And so, although I am aware that there is no evidence of any form of life other than ourselves, I also must face the mathematical reality that to assume there could be nothing else anywhere else in the world is statistically impossible.
Yeah, I really wanted to understand the manifestation of all the discoveries that we are doing today, because we now just saw the pandemic, which really shook the world and really said that, hey, this is what we are building towards, and this is not working out. And we still have an AI system which is yet to be discovered, which human is trying to mimic a human's brain. So I just wanted to realize one thing about what's the manifestation of all the discoveries that we have made today. Is it all about the destruction that we are going to face? Or is it all about the most constructive thoughts that are just going to be framed for the tomorrow's world? What is it all about when we are talking about the today's discoveries that will be the tomorrow's manifestation of all the processes that we are talking today? It can be thinking about what can be made as good as what we have today. Like, are we just trying to improvise on what we have today, or else are we trying to build something which is more supernova or a superhuman kind of stuff?
I first came to Kolkata about 45 years ago, and I discovered in my travels across India, I came to know your premier at the time, and I came to discover in my travels across India that the majority of Indian people, in terms of material possessions that we would recognize in the West, that they seem to have almost nothing. And yet they're bright, intelligent, philosophical, knowing. And in many ways they have a knowledge of the world and of the environment and of the way that the life cycles work, and indeed of human psychology, that in the West, for all our sophistication, we don't have. Now, India is a great paradox. India is the second greatest polluter of the planet, and yet it is a country in which the majority of people have a very low economic status compared to people in the West. Now, you would think on that basis that India is a backward country, an undeveloped country, but no. You have an enormous nuclear program, although annoyingly you at the moment produce no electricity from nuclear power. You have done in the past and you will do in the future, but at the moment you rely on coal, and it is this country of India which is doing so much to pollute the environment. And yet you have 1.25 trillion rupees spent on space research. So India, if you look at it in one area, is one of the most advanced and high-tech and sophisticated societies in the world. I'll give you another example of that. In Britain, the helplines for people using the internet or using computers are very often based in India, because the Indians are known to be so intelligent and so knowledgeable and so compliant and so helpful that it's better to employ people thousands of miles away in India than to try and employ people in Europe. And yet, if you look at the other end of India, it is most undeveloped and most primitive and most backward and does so little for its people. India is a great paradox. India is almost like a strange planet all on its own. There's no other place in the world like yours.
Yeah, but like, what is it all about when we are talking about the most intelligent species on the entire universe? Is it, I'm just talking in terms of the most fittest, survivable, and the intelligent species in the universe. Have we ever discovered it?
Well, I have often been interested in a model of mine of how life works. We are great multicellular organisms, trillions of cells, all working together to produce what we call human life. And I think that the way that we behave is an amplification of the way in which single cells behave. Now, there are amoeba. We learn about amoeba in school. Amoeba is the most simple, basic animal that you can possibly study. Everybody knows about amoeba. But I can show you an amoeba which makes a home for itself. It will collect little particles, and they have to be specific particles because each species of shell-building amoeba has a different building material out of which it constructs its shell. It may be sand grains, it may be little diatom frustules, but these amoeba, single cells, shapeless single cells, they can pick up these little grains and cement them together to produce a beautiful home for themselves. Now, if you made something like that in college and showed me, I'd be very impressed. And yet you're a human with a brain and with hands and tools and education and understanding. A single shapeless cell can do this. So when you talk of human intelligence, I want to say to you, well, before we start to look at human intelligence, let's look at the intelligence that resides within each tiny microbe, because cells themselves manifest intelligence. And that is an extraordinary thought. The intelligence that we are using to carry out our conversation is just the coordination of the single cell intelligence of all the neurons in our brain. Now, that is something well worth thinking about. And science as a whole never thinks that way.
We think of cancers because of a mutation of a cell. There is a way in which they spread in our entire immune system, and we talk a lot of immune system, but I feel somewhere down the line mutation is the reason why we are just alive in this polluted world, at least, because we need to evolve over a course of time. So I just wanted to understand, is mutation the reason for us being alive today, or else what is it all about when we are talking about mutation? How do we understand it, and how are we actually respecting the fact that there is mutation happening in my body, in your body right now?
You have several different points there. You mentioned cancer. To me, a cancer cell is one that's gone deaf. When the cells in the body grow, they grow in a coordinated fashion. And just think of what a miraculous thing it is. If you cut your finger and then look at it a month later, if it's a deep cut, you might even have a scar. But the skin, the blood vessels, everything has been replaced and renewed by cells which worked out themselves how to create plumbing to restore the blood vessels and how to create new skin. Your brain didn't do that, your hormones didn't do that, your glands didn't do that, the single cells in your finger did that. Now, when cancer supervenes, what happens is that cells stop taking any notice of their friends. So I don't mean audio signals, but they will sense, they will communicate with each other. And when they've grown to a certain state, they will stop growing because they now know that the organ has been constituted in the correct way, or the healing has been finished. But sometimes cells stop paying attention to what their neighbours are telling them, and they keep on growing. They grow faster and faster, and there is no means of stopping them. Now, at the moment, our therapy for cells is based on what you might call a Western militaristic view. We blast them with chemicals. We blast them with radiation. We hack them out with surgery. I sometimes wonder if a better idea would be to give each cell, if you like, a hearing aid, to restore its hearing, to give each cell the capacity once again to start communicating and listening to its friends. Because once it began to communicate with the cells around it, it would stop growing so fast. And yet, the fastest growing cells in the body are the cells in a baby, in a pregnant woman. The baby grows faster, and perfectly controlled. The baby goes faster than any cancer cell. Babies are miraculous. They grow faster than any other cell, and no cancer cell can grow as fast as the cells in a newborn baby. Now, you mentioned mutation, and mutation is not responsible for all cancers. Sometimes it is an accident. A mutation is a change in a gene. And sometimes you have a gene that drops out, or a gene that doesn't function, or a gene that functions but doesn't respond as it should. There are many causes of cancer, and those who think there is going to be an answer to cancer are misguided. There will be as many answers as there are cancers.
Yeah, that's true. So I just wanted to realize, we as a human, we are much more intelligent, and every animal is intelligent. Every animal has compassion towards its owner. Every animal has compassion towards its mates. But I wanted to realize like what's the source of intelligence in the universe, because it's allowing us to be survivable. It's allowing us to make sure that we actually make sure that our loved ones are safe. But what's the source of it? What's the source of the intelligence in the universe today?
Nobody can ever know.
I wanted to realize one thing, because a lot of times, this has really struck my thoughts in very different ways, that it has told me like, let's demystify this, because I'm trying to build a AI on one side, but there's nothing which is just as good as a brain today. So I just wanted to realize this one fact.
No, it's a good question and not one which I could possibly answer. But before you think of answers, I want you to reflect back on what I said about single cells. The intelligence of a single cell we could try to understand, because a cell is a trillionth of our size. And so we might be able to get a handle on it. But no one's looking at that. Science is not concerned with such things. We're concerned with the minutiae within cells. The scientists of the world are studying mitochondria and genes and all the organelles inside a cell. What I like to do is to step back and look at the entire cell. After all, you won't learn much about the sociology of birds by looking at a piece of cooked chicken. And yet we keep thinking that if we look at little bits of cells, we will understand what's happening to the whole cell. You need to look at an entire cell and how it lives its life. And then you will appreciate that within that cell is the root of human intelligence. And if you could understand that, then you might have a handle on intelligence. As for its origin, who can know? I see no reason to believe that there is a deity which created it. I can quite understand how, in some way, a chemical complexity can arise through competition. The notion of evolution by survival of the fittest, which of course was current long before Charles Darwin, is not an explanation for anything. There are so many beautiful things and bizarre things and strange things that would never have existed if it was simply survival of the fittest. Many living things are not fit for the way that they live their lives. But the fact remains that we do have an extraordinary abundance of life forms, and we make very little attempt to try and understand the origins of it, the roots of it, how it came about. And looking for an outside source, I don't think would answer the problem. After all, if you were to say that intelligent life has resulted from some mythical object in space, then of course you would then be faced with, and what made the mythical object in space? So it wouldn't answer the question, and it's not a thing I have ever concerned myself with, because if it is unanswerable, then I don't need to ask the question.
Yeah. But I feel this pandemic was a kind of an misconception between what was being engineered and what was being accepted by the world of science, because nobody knows what's the origin of it, but nobody knows what could have been the consequence of it until it became a chaos. So I just wanted to realize, like, could have we handled this entire pandemic in a more effective fashion? How could have we done it much more better? Because there is a reason for us to really come to the point that, yes, pandemic is left behind now, but it's evolving. It's just taking its own form, and the form factor of that virus is changing. So could have we handled this pandemic in a very better fashion, or else what is it all about according to you?
Well, there are several things we could do which we don't. One of the techniques I would like to use would be pooled sampling. Now, at the moment in Britain, everybody is being tested for COVID-19, and you have to produce evidence that you have been tested or that you have been vaccinated before you can travel and before you can do certain social events. But the point is, if you've got a school and you wonder whether the 30 or 40 pupils in your class, whether any of them is infected, then you will do 30 or 40 tests, and that will take several hours and is very complex and is quite costly. I would like to advocate that we used pooled samples, that you took the samples and put them all together and did one test. Then that one test would show you whether there was no infection at all in the class. Pooled sampling would slash the time taken and the cost involved in doing COVID-19 tests. And it does not seem to be at all popular. I mean, if, for example, you had a class of, say, 30 children, and you did a test and the test was positive, a pooled sample, you put everybody's sample together and do one test. Well, if it's positive, then you divide the class in half and do 15 tests on one. And so in that way, you could test an entire class of 30 people with perhaps half a dozen tests, instead of having to do 30 tests, one for each person, and wait for the results. So that's the first thing which I would recommend, is that people started pooling samples instead of testing every single individual person. And the second thing we should do, I think, is to start wearing gloves. Not plastic gloves, not surgical gloves that surgeons use. Latex gloves aren't any good because they create warmth and moisture and humidity inside the glove, and that would encourage bacteria to grow. No, cotton gloves. Thin white cotton gloves, the kind of gloves that people use when they're handling old documents or something. If everybody wore gloves, then they would not run the risk of picking up the virus from a surface and transferring it to their mouths. I think cotton gloves could probably halve the rate of transmission. At the present time, everybody wears a face mask. But if you look at the size of virus particles, or even aggregates of virus particles inside little droplets of water, they're far, far smaller than the holes in a mask. The kind of fabric mask that everybody wears in Europe, for example, if the hole in the mask was the size of a railway tunnel, then the COVID virus is the size of a lentil. It is ridiculous to think that a mask will stop the virus. It'll reduce the level of transmission. It might reduce it by, I don't know, 10, 20%, but it's not going to remove it. And people who feel safe with a mask on are deluding themselves. Now, we're always told you must wash your hands thoroughly and for several minutes at a time, and make sure that you really clean your hands because you may have touched something and get the virus. Well, if you wear cotton gloves, then it'll prevent the virus from getting onto your fingers in the first place. And I think people should actually wear cotton gloves when they go round and about, and I have no doubt that it wouldn't end the epidemic, but I have no doubt that would enormously reduce the rate of transmission.
Professor Brian Ford, microbiologist, is here. Hi, Professor. It's nice to talk to you.
I mentioned the idea in an interview with Andrew Easton for the BBC on the 21st of September 2020.
And a significant proportion of cases are transmitted by touch, by people holding a handrail or a doorknob or something like that. I would recommend people to start wearing those cheap disposable cotton gloves, the kind that you use to look at old books and rare jewellery. You can buy them very cheaply. The price will go up now I've said this. But in fact, if you wear cotton gloves, that will cut down your chance of picking up things.
Indeed, I published the idea with the British Medical Journal a few months ago, and I'm quite surprised nobody has followed up the idea. I have shown, by using ultraviolet on fluorescent powders, I have shown that the hands can pick up virus from any kind of, certainly from doorknobs. I mean, you might open the door of a hotel bathroom and go inside and wash your hands thoroughly, and it's completely free of virus. But then when you're going to leave the room, you immediately touch the door handle again and pick up the virus you left there in the first place. But if we all wore cotton gloves, I always do when I go out, then I think we would enormously reduce the rate of transmission. I don't think people have really got to grips with the new ideas that we need to embrace if we're ever going to conquer this pandemic. Can I ask, have you had a vaccination?
Yes, both the doses. So,
I had my first dose at the end of 2020, and I've now had, because I'm old, I've now had my 2 injections plus the 3rd booster. And I must admit that the moment that you have your vaccination, like as with all vaccinations, you feel so much more calm and so much happier and so much more content to know that the chances of catching it have suddenly been reduced.
I just wanted to ask you this one question, like, is protein more intelligent than what we are guessing about it? Like, it can go into a form of an isomers, it can take its own form factor. So I just wanted to realize, is it the protein that is making the virus more intelligent, or else is the virus evolving as an intelligent microspecies? What is it all about?
Well, you have to remember, you can't really talk about evolution in viruses as you can with animals, because viruses cannot reproduce. A virus cannot reproduce itself. A virus has to take over a cell and then commandeer the cell into making more virus. And so if, as time goes by, a virus becomes less infectious, you could say, well, that's because the virus has the intention of becoming less infectious, so that it will survive for longer inside the living cells of the host. But you could also say, no, it's the human cells which are producing the effect, because the cells recognize that they might be able to produce virus that is less dangerous than the virus which they originally contracted. So the relationship between the virus is an important thing to understand. The virus relies on the host cell to make more virus. The virus itself cannot reproduce. So whether the evolution is taking place within the virion or taking place within the human cell and the way that the human cell produces new virus, that is something which we cannot, as yet, decide for ourselves.
Yes. And also, there is COP26, and I don't know about anything, whether that was a blessing or a disguise in the form of what we were thinking about, like what can it do to the world of the medical science or anything. But I wanted to realize, was it a failure or a success story when it got introduced to the world?
I'm sorry, you have to say that again.
Was COP26 a failure or a success?
Oh, the Glasgow conference.
Yes.
Well,
you had almost all the countries of the world sent leaders, and those that didn't sent representatives. And yet they didn't begin to deal with the essential problem. They acted all the time as though you had wealthy white nations that were polluting the world and damaging it for the poorer nations. But most of the pollution comes from poor nations like India and China. It is not true that most of it is coming just from the developed white nations. Britain, for example, has done so much to reduce the levels of carbon dioxide that we put into the atmosphere. India hasn't. India has increased, and nor has China. India doesn't even want to stabilise until 2070. And yet all the discussion was about how to stop these wealthy white nations from polluting everybody else's world. And nobody mentioned the crucial fact that even if we stopped all putting of CO2 into the atmosphere today, let's just assume that all production of carbon dioxide and all liberation of methane into the air stopped today, so there was no more ever put into the atmosphere. It has already been spoiled. Already countries are suffering. There are tropical countries like Madagascar where the people, their rivers have dried up, their crops have died, and the people are on the verge of starvation. There are nations with low-lying islands like the Marshall Islands where, because the sea is warming, it is expanding, as everything does when it warms. The expansion of the sea, the rising of the sea, is not caused by melting ice, so much as by the fact that as the sea warms, it expands. And those countries are being literally destroyed by the levels of carbon dioxide and methane in the air now. All they're talking about is trying to reduce the rate at which carbon dioxide increases. The one subject that nobody mentioned was our need to get rid of carbon dioxide from the air in the first place. There's a chap, Chris Packham, who posted a video, and in it he makes the most amazing negative assumptions about the way in which the world is going.
There's been precious little conversation about things like agriculture, factory farming, overfishing, the oceanic ecosystems. They're pressing on with their own mean motives, and it's going to kill us all.
The one he didn't put in his list, however, is the most important thing of all, and that is that we are not doing anything to get rid of the CO2 that's going into the air. there isn't actually any reason why we shouldn't burn coal or burn oil if we can scrub the exhaust gases and make sure that the carbon dioxide and the other noxious effluvia that come from the combustion of petrochemicals don't go into the air. Nobody mentioned getting rid of carbon dioxide. They all mentioned trying to reduce the rate at which we make new carbon dioxide. And that seems to me to be a fundamental mistake. I wanted somebody to talk about how can we stop the carbon dioxide going into the air when we burn coal? Not stop burning coal, but why can we not concentrate on finding ways of removing the dangerous components of gases before they go into the atmosphere? And also nobody mentioned the other thing, which is where are we going to get our ultimate energy from? There's been almost a war against plastics. But plastics are extraordinarily efficient. Most people in Britain now who are socially conscious buy a Hessin bag, a bag made of organic fibres. And they think by doing so they're doing a favour. No, they're not. If you go to areas of the world where they grow Hessin, and you will discover that entire nations of rainforests have been wiped out in order to grow these fibrous crops to produce Hessin in order to make into bags for Westerners to feel good about their consciences. A way of life has gone. A rainforest has gone. An entire community has been decimated so that people can feel good about having Hessin or cloth bags. It's a myth that it does any good. People are so opposed to plastic, and indeed I see so many shops which say we're now not using plastic anymore, we're only using paper. But just look at the figures. To produce 1,000 grocery-sized shopping bags, the weight, if they're paper, is £140. It's 10 times less if they're plastic bags. The amount of area that the paper bags occupy is 18 cubic feet almost. It's less than half a cubic feet if they're plastic. The cost is over $200 if they're paper. It's about $24 if they're plastic. The petroleum used is more than £3.50 for the paper bags, but only £1.50 for plastic. And the amount of energy that is involved is over 1 million, more than 1.5 million BTUs if you're going to produce paper, and it's just over 500,000 if you're going to produce plastic. I'd be much more impressed if I thought that whoever drew up these tables could spell words like emission and petroleum like a literary, normal individual. Paper takes a long time to degenerate, to be reduced back from paper, and then ends up as carbon dioxide going into the atmosphere, whereas plastic does not. And people keep saying it's terrible that plastic doesn't biodegrade. No, that's the whole point of plastic. The fact that it doesn't biodegrade is the best news about plastic. If you've got sewage pipes, drainage pipes, water supply pipes, gas pipes made of plastic, you don't want them to degrade. You need them to stay functioning for as long as you possibly can to keep people in developing countries alive. Plastic is one of the best things we have. Without it, there would be no aeroplanes, no operating theatres, no schools, no transport. It is almost impossible to imagine life without plastic. The problem is, of course, that you see plastic pollution in the oceans, and everybody now says, well, blame companies like Coca-Cola for their one-use plastic bottles. But that's not how the bottles get there. You can't blame the company. When plastic gets into the ocean, it's because a person has knowingly thrown it there. People dispose of plastic. I've seen it in India. People dispose of plastic by throwing it into the countryside, and it eventually ends up polluting the land, and it may well then pollute the sea. The plastic in the oceans is not the fault of the companies that produce the plastic. It is entirely the fault of the people concerned. And if you go and look at a huge demonstration against plastic, like Extinction Rebellion, for example, you'll find so many large international bodies that will have huge gatherings to protest. And when they leave, there's mounds of plastic rubbish everywhere. People spend days picking it all up. The polluters are actually the protesters. And that is something that nobody ever really deals with. You hear a lot from the youngsters, particularly Greta Thunberg, saying how you hear nothing but blah, blah, blah. Now, long live the youngsters. So many congratulations should go to them for stirring up discussion. I'm all for their energy. But, hate to say it, but the youngsters do nothing but blah, blah, blah themselves. None of them come out with any ideas. They simply say something must be done. And we've been saying that in Europe for decades. Now, at long last, it's beginning to happen, but I'd be more impressed if the protesters, firstly, didn't leave any plastic behind after they'd had their demonstrations. And secondly, if they came up with some ideas. I'll give you 2 ideas. The first is the reuse of plastic. And I don't mean recycling. Recycling is where you take an old bottle and make it into a new bottle. No, I'm talking about reuse. I would like everybody to dump all plastic into specific plastic containers, receptacles, and then let's grind up the plastic, chop it up into little bits about the size of half a finger, and use it as a ballast to make roads. At the moment, we quarry stone and aggregate from the ground and leave enormous scars across the landscape. Well, I'd much prefer it if we used waste plastic to make roads, to make buildings, blend it with cement to make concrete buildings, for example. In that way, we could reuse plastic and it would last for a very long time because it doesn't degrade. And so we could actually create roads, buildings, the things that we need with plastic instead of taking more aggregate and limestone from the landscape. And as for energy, well, people keep saying we're going to cut back the amount of petrochemicals that we burn. Let's have some wind power. No, nobody ever mentions the most vital form of energy and the most obvious form of energy and the most abundant form of energy of all. And I referred to it many years ago when I wrote a report for NESTA, the National Endowment for Science, Technology and the Arts in Britain. And in that I pointed out that the official sources were talking about nuclear power and petrochemical power, wind power and wave power and water power, but they never mentioned geothermal power. Beneath our feet is more energy than the world could ever use. And I am astonished that there was no mention of geothermal power in the recent Glasgow conference. COP26 should have been saying, firstly, we are going to emphasise ways of removing carbon dioxide before it leaves the chimney. And secondly, we are going to look at ways of harnessing geothermal power because that won't run out, it doesn't pollute, and it is available everywhere. Now, 50 years ago, geothermal power was quite hard to extract, unless you lived in somewhere like Iceland, where you have geothermal energy very close to hand. But now we're much closer to that. We can drill down and extract the heat that lies beneath our feet. And that would solve all our problems because it would be unending, and unlike nuclear fuel, it wouldn't leave any noxious residues that could pollute the environment. Geothermal power is what we need, and scrubbing carbon dioxide out of flue gases is what we should have been talking about at COP26, and neither of those was mentioned.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. Even the articles regarding that, a lot of other news regarding that, I feel that, there was a little bit more emphasis that was supposed to be given for all these topics that you said. And also, like, when we are talking about like psychology of an human being, I feel that we are just living in a simulation of what we are built for. Like, we are just a biological system that is being simulated by the way our psychology is evolving. But on the other side, when we see something called as placebo, there is something called as phantom pain, I feel that we linger on the thoughts that were always being there. We always are so fascinated by the one which really fascinates us and says that, hey, this is something unique and let's learn it and learn it. So I just wanted to realize, like, what are we as a biological species? Are we just the simulation of our psychology that we are developing over the course of time? Or else, what are we all about when we are reacting to it? Because when I see a dog, which is there in a dark for a very long time, it's so ferocious. But the same dog going on to a places, meeting people, understanding the ways in which the society works, that changes it. So what is it all about when we are actuating the way which our psychology is being architected in our mind?
Well, we understand so little about human psychology. We think we understand a lot, but we don't. And you mentioned the placebo effect, which is a really great example. Now, when I was very young, I worked for a year at the Medical Research Council in England. And my boss was Professor Scott Thompson, a very clever man. And one of the tests that we were doing involved administering an experimental drug to patients in the hospital. Patients had come in and were asked, would you like to take part in a trial? And a large number of them, about 100, said yes, they would. So we divided them into two groups. And one group was going to have the placebo, and the other group was going to have the drug. And I said to Professor Scott Thompson, right, we've got them all ready. Shall I take them over to the ward? And he said, no. No, he said, deliver them to the nurses. And the nurses will then give them out. And I said, why? Well, he said, we know which are the real pills and which ones are the inert substitute, the placebo. And that might influence subconsciously the way in which the patients react to the pill. If we give them to the nurses won't know whether it's a real pill or a false pill. So the nurses will go and give them out to the patients, and the patients will take them and never know the difference. And that way we can be sure that the pill is the thing that is causing the cure. So I said, why do we have to do this? And he said, well, the reason we need to do it is because if we take the pills ourselves, because of our knowledge, we might hint something. I said, yes, you said that. So does that mean to say that if we imply to somebody, you know, this is going to do you good, or this is going to do you harm, this is going to cure you, or this isn't going to... He said, yes, they may pick up some subconscious cues. I said, right. And can those cues be as strong as the effect of the pills? And he said, yes, sometimes it can. That's the whole point. And I said, oh, well, then here's an answer. Why don't we only give people placebos, but give them the pills as though we think the pills are going to cure them? Because then they could just get cured with placebos and you wouldn't need the pills. And he said, no, you don't understand me. We had to do a double-blind trial where we give the pills to the girls and the girls hand the pills out in the ward. And I said, yes, you don't understand what I'm saying. You have told me that subconscious cues can have almost as great an effect as a medicament in a tablet. And I'm saying to you, rather than perfect the tablet, what about perfecting the way of giving the cue to the patient? Because then you could cure them without the need for medicine. And do you know, he never understood what it was that I was saying. And it's only in recent years that people in the West have begun to take the concept of placebo medicine and possible placebo cures at all seriously. But yes, you can influence people at a subconscious level and have them do extraordinary things. And this is an area of psychology that hardly anybody has begun to probe. I think they should.
Yeah, but what is that instance that really just shook the experience of any human being? Like, it's something like, sometimes we also adhere to the fact that, hey, he's in the dark. So we sometimes need not have to neglect him. We just need to just cheer him up, just move the way he was thinking about. Sometimes the psychology affects a lot. But I wanted to know, why is there still an existence of good and bad in the world? Because, I just gave you an example of a dog which really can understand when it's there in the dark, it becomes more ferocious. But as soon as it starts wandering around the world, it gathers an experience and it becomes more intuitive about the thoughts which are there next to it, and it starts realizing it. There's a concept of meditation and concept of all these thought processes that we are talking today. So I just wanted to know, why is there an existence of good and the bad that we are talking in the world today, though there is an immense source of knowledge that we are gathering over a course of time? What is the reason behind it? So it's a philosophical one.
No, I have no idea. It's almost like the ancient Christian dogma of original sin, where everybody is born sinful, and we are sinful because we exist, and therefore through religion we can shed our sin. I don't believe that for a moment. I think that little babies, for example, are born, certainly they have guile, and they're often crafty, and they can often read their parents. A little child of 3 or 4 will understand that if you want what you would like to get, it's a good idea to say, "Oh, mummy, I love you so much." And the child knows that he's not necessarily saying it because he wants to express love for his mother, but because he wants another piece of chocolate. And if you say that, I mean, right from the earliest age, children are dealing in psychology in that way. But where its origin might be, I really don't know. We have dogs, and it is customary in the West to train a dog so that you will say sit, or stay, or lie down, or roll over, and the dog will immediately respond. It becomes conditioned in the Pavlovian sense and automatically responds to your voice. I've never done that with our dogs. If I'm going to say to a dog, you know, I want to sit on the chair where you are, I would say to the dog, "Come on, I want to sit there." Or, "Can I come and sit there, please?" And the dog understands perfectly well what it is you're saying. You don't need the actual words. And so we sort of communicate in many layers to our pets. We don't just give them specific words that they've been trained to understand. And in fact, animals show all sorts of layers of psychological understanding that I think skates past so many people. I don't like the idea of training a dog. What I like to do is to educate a dog, to learn a way of communicating with a dog. People sometimes say, "Oh, my dog can understand every word I say." No, they can't understand every word, but they do understand these subtle movements. It's almost like the placebo effect I mentioned just now. Sort of deep subconscious cues that we're hardly aware of can communicate themselves to doctors and can influence the way that our bodies get well. And in exactly the same way, those subtle cues can implant themselves into the mind of a dog. And you can, as it were, communicate with a dog without even knowing that you're doing it. You know, this is interesting, and it ties in with many of the ancient ideas of philosophy in India. After all, Ayurvedic medicine from India, about which I recently wrote a paper that referred to it, has a very ancient tradition of trying to understand the way in which humans interact with the world. And in many ways, I think in the West, we could benefit from some of those deeper philosophical understandings.
Yeah. You know, recently BBC held a Scientist Day, and today's BBC broadcast is something which is more phenomenal because there is a lot of graphics. But what do you feel about today's BBC broadcaster? Are they good, or else what is it all about according to you?
I've been broadcasting for the BBC for 60 years in 2022, since I did my first television broadcast for the BBC. It's an extraordinary thought. But although we like to think that the BBC gives us such a great insight into science, very often it doesn't. Let me give you an example. Here is a man called Jim Al-Khalidi. He's a very popular broadcaster on British television. And some years ago, he was going to, in a programme, demonstrate how it is that Robert Brown observed Brownian motion. And just watch what Jim said.
In 1827, a Scottish botanist called Robert Brown sprinkled pollen grains in some water and examined it through a microscope. What he found was really strange, because instead of the pollen grains floating gently in the water, they danced around furiously, almost as though they were alive. For nearly 80 years, Brown's discovery remained a little-known scientific anomaly. Then Einstein changed everything. The pollen will only jiggle if they were being jostled by something else. So Einstein said that the water must be made of tiny atom-like particles, which themselves are jiggling and are continually buffeting the pollen. If there were no atoms, then the pollen would stay still.
That's completely wrong. The view that you saw, as though Jim was looking through a microscope, was a view of Indian ink particles, nothing to do with pollen. And in fact, Jim and the programme completely misunderstand the experiment. Robert Brown did not see the movement of pollen grains. What he saw was the movement of particles inside pollen grains, particles that are thousands of times smaller than pollen grains are themselves. Now, I published some years ago in Nature a re-examination of the way in which Robert Brown saw Brownian motion. It's a most interesting phenomenon. If you look at any tiny particles under the microscope in a liquid, they're always jiggling about. And indeed, it is because of the bombardment of atoms, and Einstein was certainly not the first person to realise that that was the case, although Einstein did the maths that proved it. But that entire demonstration that Jim did, the sprinkling on the water, no. He looked at pollen grains on a slider under a microscope. It was an entire misrepresentation. And here's another case. Very popular British broadcaster Adam Rutherford, who studied genetics. And he went to Holland to look at a Leeuwenhoek microscope, a microscope from the 1600s. And he didn't even know which side you look at.
What do I actually do? Where am I looking?
At the wrong side. You must look through this hole.
Once he'd been shown the right way of looking at it, he was in awe of the wonderful things you could see. And this is how the programme went.
There's a tiny, tiny bug in there, which is scooting around, which I guess is a protozoa. That's astonishing.
But but you could see hardly anything. It's absolutely laughable. This is what you could see through one of those single lens microscopes, used properly. And I carried out this experiment just to prove the point. The BBC programme had a budget of hundreds of thousands of dollars, and yet they couldn't do it. And indeed, Rutherford came back again shortly afterwards to demonstrate sperm. And he got so excited at how you could see spermatozoa swimming under a lens.
But, you know, there they are. Tiny little atoms swimming along. They look kind of like tadpoles. In his own semen, Van Leeuwenhoek would have seen the same thing. Thousands of tiny little animalcules powering along with whiplash-like tails.
But in fact, you can't see anything. The script is correct, but the BBC were unable, for all their technical expertise, to actually show sperm cells. Now, Leeuwenhoek, he didn't look at a bottle of sperm. He looked at sperm cells in bodily fluids, in vaginal mucosa, which is much harder to find sperm. And I took photographs through the same kind of microscope, and this is how you see sperm. You can see the head and the centerpiece and the tail as these diminutive little cells are swimming about in bodily fluids. And in fact, you could see perfectly clearly what sperm were like. It's just that they did the experiment all wrong from top to bottom. And here's a final example. There's a chap who's always on BBC television called Michael Mosley. And he was completely conned by a specious piece of research. There is a practice, a very dubious practice called live blood testing, where you look at living blood cells under the microscope. And here is an example.
Good afternoon, everyone. This is Kevin Gianni from the Renegade Health Show, and today is November 14th. I'm going to go do some live blood in LA. I'm pretty sure that my live blood will not turn out to be stellar.
We're going to look at the quality of the red blood cells, how they are, if they're nice and round, if they're thin or thick, if they are all clumped together or flowing around freely, how your white blood cells are they crawling around looking for stuff in your blood serum, foreign invaders, or are they just sitting in the corner waiting until they're waking up, which is not a very active immune system. This is you. You look nice.
That's pretty good.
Really?
Uh-huh.
What's that thing?
That's a blood platelet. The reason they show up in your blood serum is because your pH balance is slightly off. Disease comes in an anaerobic body. Anaerobic means deprived of oxygen.
Right.
Cancer thrives in an anaerobic body, as an extreme example of disease.
Right.
So yours looks pretty cool at this point.
Good.
Yeah.
I was concerned because I've had low minerals because of what I've been going through.
So So I hope you guys enjoyed that. That was a lot of fun and extremely informative. And Kevin Gianni, and my question to you is, have you seen your blood before?
Now, live blood testing is a con. Here's another case in point. This is part of a talk by Dr. Victor Marshall Vega, who says he studied at Johns Hopkins University, but whom some television programs have looked into and say his PhD doesn't even exist. But look at the way that he describes these blood cells.
You see these little dots in the background? These are bacteria in the blood. We are not sterile. In this particular person, the bacteria levels are way above normal. These dark spots here in the background, they're pieces of cholesterol. This is what happened 24 to 36 hours after taking Golgi in that same patient.
Now, this man has published well over 50 health food books, all extolling things like goji berries. But the results that he shows you are completely fictitious. That's what blood cells normally look like under the microscope. And the little spots that he shows, they're not bacteria. They're blood platelets. They always occur in blood. And yet people, time and time again, are taken in by this. And Michael Mosley was. He went to a clinic in London where a chap actually carried out live blood analysis on him, and he put it into a programme.
I'm visiting blood analyst Errol Denton. Errol examined my blood 2 weeks ago. Blood then. You want more blood?
Yes, please.
What are you seeing?
We've definitely seen more activity in the white blood cells this time compared to before, although the numbers are more or less the same.
The more active or mobile the white blood cells, the more infections they encounter and destroy. A real boost to my immune system would have also seen their numbers rise. Some studies have indeed seen this more dramatic response. So, there you go.
In fact, the same chap was later prosecuted for fraud. And yet all of these things appear on television from people who seem perfectly reputable. They're good looking, they speak well, they have charisma. And yet what the BBC is putting up is just a series of fictions. I mean, you wouldn't get away with it if you, I don't know, showed a sequence of a rugby game and described it as though it was cricket. You wouldn't get away with showing somebody a chihuahua and saying this is a kitten. And yet the BBC scientists managed to get away with just pandering to the fact that the public are ignorant of science. And time after time after time, in so many examples, they produce a myth, a bunch of falsehoods, and the public, instead of learning science, are taught things that simply aren't true. I find it astonishing. It was politics, or sport, or cookery, or art, or literature, you'd never get away with it. But in science, people get away with talking nonsense on the television all the time, and I am at a loss to know how they get away with it.
That's true. That's true. I think, thank you so much, sir. Thank you so much for such great insights. And I think probably this is what we require. It's not about the biology being the worst nightmare for some folks. It's all about you getting that right insights. And I think, thank you so much for such a great insights. And it's an honor to have you on my podcast. It's an immense honor to have you on my podcast, to get these great insights on my podcast. It means a lot to me. Thank you so much, sir.
My absolute pleasure. And you can't imagine how much I get an extra pleasure at being linked back to India. I have travelled widely in your great country. I have greatly enjoyed my experiences of meeting Indian people, north, south, and indeed even in that great, crowded, wonderful jumble of a city of Kolkata. To make that connection again was for me a great personal pleasure, and I'm delighted that you thought to invite me. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.